against the lonely shores of Roanoke Island. But if you listen closely, the sound is not just water meeting sand. It is softer, stranger, almost like whispers carried through time. This place is more than a coastline. It is a wound carved into history. To most, Roanoke is a page in a textbook, reduced to a single haunting word carved into wood, Croatoan. But the earth here carries weight. The air feels heavy, as though it remembers what people have long forgotten. Locals speak of nights when the sea grows unnaturally still. When the fog presses so close, it feels alive. In those moments, some claim to hear more than silent, faint static, broken voices and echoes that never should exist. This isn't just history, it is a story that refuses to rest. And the deeper you listen, the clearer one question becomes. What if Roanoke never vanished at all? The dream of Roanoke began not as a mystery, but as a promise. In the summer of 1587, more than 100 men, women, and children set foot on the island's sandy shores with visions of a new beginning. To them, this was not just land, it was hope, a chance to plant English roots across the Atlantic, to build homes that would last, and to secure a foothold in the new world. Among them was Eleanor Dare, daughter of Governor John White. She carried not only the burden of survival, but the spark of legacy. That spark came to life when she gave birth to Virginia Dare, the first English child born on American soil. For the settlers, the child's cry was a symbol of endurance. Against storms, hunger, and uneasy alliances with native tribes, life still pushed forward. And yet, beneath this fragile hope, shadows gathered. Supplies dwindled faster than expected. Relations with neighboring tribes shifted between wary peace and open hostility. Storms battered the coast, stripping away what little stability the settlers had managed to create. Even in those early days, Roanoke seemed to resist them, as though the island itself did not want to be claimed. Governor White knew his people could not last without help, and so, in a decision that would prove fateful, he sailed back to England to secure more provisions. He promised to return within months, but history rarely bends to human promising. War with Spain dragged England into conflict, and White's return was delayed not by weeks or months, but by years. When he finally reached Roanoke in 1590, he did not find struggle. He did not find graves. He did not find chaos. What he found was worse, silence. The settlement stood eerily intact, houses dismantled with care rather than destroyed by violence. The colonists' possessions were gone, but there were no signs of bloodshed, no evidence of disease, no indication of panic. It was as though the entire colony had simply stood up one day and walked away together. Only one clue remained. On a wooden post carved in stark letters was a single word, Croatoan. Nearby, the letters CRO were etched into a tree. To White, this message was both relief and torment. Relief because it suggested the colonists had not been wiped out. Torment because it offered no certainty. Croatoan was the name of a nearby island, home to a friendly tribe. Had his people gone there? Or was the word something else? A message meant not for safety, but for warning? White attempted to search, but storms forced his ship away. He never laid eyes on his family or the settlers again. And history closed its official record there, leaving behind only questions. Over centuries, theories multiplied. Some claimed the settlers integrated into local tribes, their descendants scattered and hidden in plain sight. Others believed disease or starvation carried them away. Still others whispered of darker fates, massacre, betrayal, or something unearthly that lived in the silence of the island. But here is what makes Roanoke different from other historical mysteries. The absence of answers becomes its own kind of present. If the colonists fled, why leave no trace of belonging? If they were killed, where were the bodies? If they joined with tribes, why did no record, no story, no proof survive? Every explanation unravels when weighed against the silent. And so Roanoke lingers not as history, but as a haunting. A story that does not end because it cannot. Cliffhanger. And just when the mystery should have faded into textbook, whispers began to rise again from the fog, from the waves, from the very air itself. History may have ended the story of Roanoke with John White's return, to an empty colony. But silence has never been the final word. For generations, whispers filled the void where facts should have been. In taverns, in village squares, and later in classrooms, the mystery of the vanished settlers grew into something larger than history. It became legend. The earliest whispers were born from necessity. The English, desperate to make sense of the disappearance, spun theories to ease their unease. Some said the settlers had simply moved inland, blending with friendly tribe. Others suggested they had fled south, seeking safety far from the coast. But these explanations are never satisfying. Too much had been left behind. Too carefully had the houses been dismantled. Too perfect was the absence, and so darker whispers took root. Tales spread of starvation so desperate that the colonists turned on one another, of massacres carried out by hostile tribes who buried every trace. But none of these stories explained the word carved into wood or why no bones were ever found. Then came the legends whispered by those who lived closest to the island, the native tribe. To them, Roanoke was not simply a patch of land. It was a boundary, a place where the sea and the spirit world blurred. Some spoke of spirits that guarded the coastline, punishing those who trespassed. Others described a being that lured wanderers away, leaving only silence in their place. Fishermen told of nights when the ocean grew too calm, as though the waves themselves were holding their breath. Travelers claimed that fog would gather without warning, curling thick and heavy until the air pressed against their skin like invisible hands. In those moments, birds stopped calling, and even their own footsteps seemed too loud. They called it the listening hour, a time when something unseen pressed close, waiting. What unsettled these whispers was not only their content, but their consistency. Generation after generation, people told the same kinds of stories. A shadow glimpsed near the tree line, lights flickering above the water in an unnatural rhythm. Voices carried on winds that should have been silent. Perhaps most chilling were the disappearances that followed these whispers. Hunters who entered the woods and never returned. Fishermen whose boats washed ashore. What makes these whispers endure is their rhythm. They do not feel like invention. They feel like repetition, as if the island has been telling the same story again and again, using different people as its words. And if the whispers were only folklore, they might have faded. But centuries later, the silence of Roanoke would return, not in legend, not in rumor, but in something far harder to dismiss. Cliffhanger. Because the whispers were no longer confined to the past, they began to bleed through the airwaves. For centuries, the story of Roanoke remained confined to books, folklore, and fireside whispers. But in the 20th century, the silence began to stir again. This time, it did not come from carved wood or faded journals. It came from the air itself. It started quietly, almost by accident. Amateur radio operators, hobbyists, scanning the static late at night, noticed something strange. Among the endless hiss of shortwave frequencies, a pattern seemed to emerge. Not mechanical beeps, not the usual bursts of interference, but cadences, rhythms, sounds that felt human. At first, they dismissed it as imagination. Radio signals bounce across the atmosphere in unpredictable ways. Weather, storms, and even solar flares can bend sound until it seems to speak. But then came the voices. One operator in Virginia claimed he recorded bursts of static that, when slowed down and filtered, revealed fragments of word. Not modern English, but something older. The vowels stretched strangely, the consonants clipped in ways long forgotten. To his ears, it sounded like Elizabethan English, the very dialect spoken by the colonists of Roanoke. He wasn't alone. Dozens of operators across different states reported hearing the same thing. Faint, broken prayers. Names carried on the hiss of static. Sometimes the voices rose and fell like waves. Other times, they cracked through the silence with chilling clarity. The consistency made it hard to dismiss. These were not isolated accidents. Independent listeners were capturing nearly identical fragments at the same time, as though the same signal was echoing outward, searching for ears willing to hear. Some recordings contained simple, desperate pleas: bread, water, storm. Others seemed far darker. One contained the sea, the hunger, the watch. Another more disturbing still, captured a voice crying out a name, Eleanor, a name tied directly to one of Roanoke's most enduring figures. Skeptics argued that the human brain has a tendency to force patterns onto random noise, a phenomenon known as pareidolia. To them, the voices were nothing more than tricks of perception, the mind hearing what it expects to hear. But even skeptics struggled to explain the timing. Many of the transmissions were strongest during storm, as if thunder itself carried the messages closer. Others cut off mid-sentence, replaced suddenly by silence, leaving only the hiss of static behind. For those who listened, the effect was haunting. They weren't simply hearing interference. They felt as though someone or something was trying desperately to reach them. A presence bleeding through time, demanding not to be forgotten. And yet, one detail stood out above all the others. Across countless recordings separated by miles, states, and even decades, the voices ended the same way. Always the same final warning, do not answer. What were the voices trying to protect us from? Were they the echoes of lost colonists, trapped in some impossible loop, replaying their final moments across centuries? Or were they something else entirely, something using those voices as bait, luring new listeners closer? The signals should not exist. Radio was centuries away when the settlers vanished, and yet the airwaves carried their echoes as if time itself had folded. Cliffhanger. And just when people began dismissing the reports as hoaxes, the silence of Roanoke returned in a far more personal way, through the journal of a man who lived alone by the sea. Long before radio signals crackled with impossible voices, one man heard something far stranger with nothing more than his ears. His story did not spread through newspapers or official records. It survived in the fragile pages of a journal, written by hand under the dim glow of a lantern. In the early 1900s, a lighthouse keeper was stationed near Roanoke Island. His job was lonely but simple: keep the light burning, guide ships safely through the dark, and endure the endless rhythm of wave. At first, his journal was ordinary. He wrote of storms battering the coastline, long nights of silence, and the aching solitude of watching the sea. But as the entries continued, the tone began to shift. He described hearing voices drifting through the fog, not shouts from distant ships, not the cries of gulls, but words, distinct syllables carried on air that should have been empty. At times, they seemed to come from the waves themselves, as though someone were speaking from beneath the water. Other nights, the voices circled the lighthouse, echoing faintly against the stones. The words, when he could make them out, were unnerving. Broken fragments of pleas for bread and water, repeated names that meant nothing to him. He noted their strange cadence, archaic, unfamiliar, yet unmistakably human. The voices were not random. They carried intent. Then came the lights. The keeper described them as glimmers hovering above the waterline, too steady to be lanterns, too bright to be tricks of reflection. On one occasion, he recorded a line of lights stretching into the horizon, flickering in rhythm as if trying to mimic a message. His fear deepened as the weeks passed. He wrote of waking in the night, convinced that someone was calling his name from outside the lighthouse walls. Each time he searched but found nothing, only fog curling at the door, reshaping itself like figures dissolving into the mist. The journal reveals a man struggling to remain rational. He measured tides, he recorded wind speeds, he tracked weather conditions meticulously, convinced that the voices must have a natural explanation. But no matter the data, the voices returned. The lights appeared whether the seas were calm or violent. The pattern defied reason. One entry, near the end, is perhaps the most chilling of all. They are closer tonight. The words are clearer. They ask for bread, for water, for names I cannot know. And when I do not answer, they weep. Soon after, the keeper abandoned his post. He requested transfer inland without explanation. His journals vanished into forgotten storage, gathering dust for decades. Only later did they resurface, tucked among coastal records, just as modern radio. The mystery of Roanoke did not end with the colony, nor with a lone lighthouse keeper haunted by whispers in the fog. The silence had a rhythm, a pattern, one that stretched across generations. Time and again, ordinary lives were interrupted by extraordinary disappearances, each one echoing the same unsettling theme: absence without explanation. The first widely whispered tale came in the 1920s. 3 small fishing boats left harbor one morning, crewed by men who knew the tides better than their own heartbeats. None returned. Search parties combed the coastline until finally 2 of the boats were discovered adrift. Their nets were coiled neatly, gear still intact, food untouched. There were no signs of struggle, no marks of storm damage. The men were simply gone. The 3rd boat was never found, as though the sea itself had claimed it. Decades later, the pattern repeated. A family of 4 set out in a pleasure craft, sailing toward the inlet. They were seen waving from the deck, smiling under the afternoon sun. Hours later, their boat was discovered run aground on a sandbar. The engine idled quietly, food sat arranged on the table below deck, and every life jacket hung in its proper place. But the family had vanished. No footprints led away, no belongings were missing. It was as though they had stepped off the boat into thin air. The woods of Roanoke tell the same story. Hikers wandering well-marked trails never returned. Search parties found their gear propped neatly against tree trunks, maps folded carefully inside backpacks. In one case, footprints led into soft earth, human at first, then fading abruptly into nothing, swallowed by moss and silence. These vanishings unsettled locals in ways that storms or shipwrecks never could. Storms leave destruction. Accidents leave debris. But Roanoke's vanishings left nothing. Each one was too perfect, too clean, as if carefully staged by unseen hand. Researchers, years later, noticed something even more chilling. Many of these disappearances coincided with unusual disturbances on the airwave. Amateur operators reported static and interference spiking during the same days people went missing. Recordings surfaced of faint voices woven into the hiss, fragments of words breaking through just enough to unsettle, never enough to explain. Locals added another detail, one passed quietly through generation. On nights before the disappearances, the air grew heavy, pressing against lungs like a warning. Birds fell silent, insects still. Fishermen called it the listening hour. Hikers described it as the moment when even their own breathing sounded too loud, a hush too complete to be natural. When combined, the stories paint a pattern too deliberate to ignore. The sea, the woods, the very air around Roanoke seemed to demand something, a toll, and every generation it claimed lives to satisfy that silence. If the lighthouse keeper's journals were a solitary haunting, these vanishings turned them into a cycle, a rhythm repeating itself over centuries, each absence another verse in a song the island refused to stop singing. Perhaps that is why the disappearances feel so suffocating. They are not random. They are not accidents. They are echoes, new chapters in the same unfinished story. And the deeper researchers dug, the more the pattern pointed towards something waiting at the heart of the mystery. Something unseen but always watching. Cliffhanger. Because where there are vanishing, there are eyes. And Roanoke's silence would soon be given a figure, the Watcher. Every legend, no matter how vague, eventually takes on a shape. For Roanoke, that shape is known only in hushed tones as the Watcher. It is not written into official records, nor spoken openly by locals, but the figure has lingered in whispered accounts for generations, a silhouette glimpsed at the edge of vision, a presence that does not chase or attack, but simply observes, silent, patient, relentless. Fishermen describe it as a tall outline standing motionless on the dune, always at dusk, always staring toward the horizon. Hikers claim they've caught sight of it between the trees, an elongated shadow that vanishes the instant they turn to face it. Park rangers speak of reflections, shapes appearing not on the sand but standing atop the waves themselves, rippling faintly with the water, yet never sinking beneath it. No footprints mark its passing. No sound betrays its... The Watcher leaves nothing but stillness, a pause in the world itself, as though time holds its breath when it appears. What unsettles researchers is not the figure's existence in folklore, but its consistency across accounts. Different people, separated by decades, describe the same thing: tall, dark, silent, and always tied to nights when strange signals surged across the airwaves. The watcher comes when the voices are strongest, as though drawn to the static, or perhaps feeding on it. Older traditions among native tribes paint an even more disturbing picture. Long before the English settlers arrived, tribes spoke of a spirit that guarded the coastline. To some, it was a sentinel, protector of boundaries between land and sea. To others, it was a predator, punishing those who trespassed. One legend warned of a being that lured people away, leading them into the fog, where they were never seen again. The colonists may have called it the Watcher, but the tribes insisted it was older, something that belonged to the land itself. Skeptics dismiss these stories as tricks of the mind. Fog bends shadows in unnatural ways. Isolation makes the mind conjure. But dismissals cannot explain why the descriptions never change, why time after time people report the same silent silhouette, tied always to the same rhythms of silence, static, and vanishing lives. Some believe the Watcher is not an individual figure at all, but the colony itself, an echo of the vanished settler, fused to single shadow, a manifestation of absence watching across centuries, reminding the living of a mystery that refuses to die. Others suggest the Watcher is a lure, a decoy meant to draw the curious closer. Its silence beckons, its presence unsettled. And the more people focus on it, the stronger the signals grow, as if both figure and static are two faces of the same haunting. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Watcher is its timing. It is never seen in daylight, never appears when the world is loud. It comes only when dusk falls, when the horizon blurs, when static sharpens across the air. Always in moments when silence presses too heavy. Always just before someone vanishes. Is the Watcher a guardian, holding back forces not understood? A predator drawing lives into Roanoke's silence? Or something even older, ensuring the mystery will never be solved? No one knows, but everyone agrees on one truth. When the Watcher appears, you are not alone. And when its eyes fall on you, the silence feels endless. Cliffhanger. Soon, investigators would attempt to confront the mystery directly. But what they uncovered on find explanations, reflections of radio waves, misheard static, perhaps even deliberate pranks. On their first night, the fog arrived heavier than forecasts predicted. It rolled across the camp like a shroud, muting every sound except the steady hum of their generators. That was when the equipment began to fail. Batteries drained without warning. Recorders clicked off, their tapes spinning into silence. Power monitors spiked erratically, then dipped as though something unseen was feeding on their charge. Then came the voices. At first, faint bursts, indistinct enough to dismiss as interference. But hour by hour, the transmissions grew stronger. The team captured multiple samples, later transcribed into fragments that still circulate in obscure corners of the internet. Pleas for bread, cries for water, weeping layered beneath static. And through it all, one repeated phrase: do not answer. By the second night, the atmosphere itself seemed to rebel. Their journals described sudden drops in temperature, frost forming on equipment, despite forecasts of mild weather. Lights appeared over the water, faint at first, then bright enough to cast shadows across the sand. One team member swore he saw a figure standing in the fog, tall and motionless. The others insisted it was nothing more than imagination, but none could explain why the static surged violently in that exact moment. The recordings from that night are the most disturbing. Voices layered over one another, growing louder until they collapsed into a unified scream. Beneath the noise, a rhythm was detected, like a heartbeat or a drum pulsing faintly through the static. One researcher wrote in his log, "It feels alive. The signal isn't just transmitting, it's watching." On the third night, their notes grew erratic. Sentences trailed off mid-thought, words scribbled in haste. Some entries broke into nonsense, others into repeated phrases as though written in panic. Then, abruptly, the recording stopped. The final audio file ends with silence, followed by a single distorted voice, clearer than any before: do not answer. Days later, searchers found the camp abandoned. Equipment left behind
intact.
Notebooks scattered on the ground.
No footprints leading away. No signs of struggle.
Just absence, too perfect, too complete, as though the team had been plucked from the world in an instant. The expedition was never officially acknowledged. The leaked documents were dismissed as fabrication, but those who have studied them insist the details are too precise, too consistent to ignore. If true, they suggest something terrifying. Roanoke's silence is not passive, it is active. It repeats, and it does not welcome those who listen too closely. Cliffhanger. And yet one piece of evidence did survive, a recording that would become known as the final signal. The abandoned camp should have been the end of the story. Tents left standing, equipment scattered, journals trailing off into silence. By all logic, the expedition was just another addition to Roanoke's long catalogue of vanishing. But there was one detail no one expected. Among the failed devices and drained batteries, a single audio file remained intact. Later smuggled out by unknown hand, it came to be known simply as the final signal. The recording begins innocently, the low crackle of static, the hum of interference, the kind of background noise any radio operator would dismiss without hesitation. But then, beneath the static, voices begin to form, faint at first, rising and falling like waves against the shore. Syllable, a fragment. Bread, hunger, storm. The same desperate words captured in earlier transmissions, but this time clearer, sharper, as though the veil between centuries was thinning. The voices multiply.
Dozens of them.
Male and female, young and old, overlapping into a suffocating chorus. Some whisper, others weep, others cry out in anguish. Listeners described the effect as claustrophobic, as if the room itself grew crowded with invisible figures pressing close. The longer the recording plays, the heavier the air seems to grow. Then, the rhythm changes. The whispers fall into strange unison, chanting syllables stretched and broken. No one has ever fully translated the words. Some insist they echo Elizabethan prayers. Others claim they are invocations, warnings, or curses. Whatever their meaning, the sound builds layer upon layer until even the static itself seems alive, swallowing everything like a rising tide. And then it happened. The chorus collapses into a single, ear-splitting scream. Not mechanical distortion, but raw, human anguish, a scream so sharp it rattles through speakers like shattering glass. Researchers who listened described it as human, but fractured, as though 100 voices had been forced into one unbearable cry. The scream lasts only seconds, but it feels endless. Then silence. Not ordinary silence, but something heavier. A silence that presses down like a weight, leaving listeners with the unsettling sense that something else has entered the room with them. For a long moment, nothing stirs. And then faintly a final voice emerges from the void. Unlike the chaos before, this one is singular, calm, steady, impossible to ignore. Do not answer. The recording ends there.
No fade, no return to static.
Just silence. Those who heard it described more than unease. Some reported feelings of being watched. Others swore they heard faint echoes of their own names whispered in the background, hidden beneath the static.
A few refused to listen a second time, insisting the file carried more than sound, something oppressive, something that lingered long after the playback stopped. Debate continues over the file's origin.
Some say it was deliberately planted, a fabrication designed to fuel the legend. Others argue it was the team's desperate attempt to leave behind a warning before they vanished. And still others believe it was not left by the team at all, but by whatever they encountered, an entity that used the recording as bait, a signal for anyone willing to listen. But one question unsettles researchers most of all. If the settlers truly vanished centuries ago, who is still speaking in their voices? Cliffhanger, because if the warning is not for them, then it must be for us. The story of Roanoke has always been more than a line in history book. It is a silence that refuses to stay silent, a question that will not fade with time. From the moment John White discovered an empty colony to the modern recordings of impossible voices, the mystery has stretched across centuries like a shadow. Perhaps the colonists did starve. Perhaps they fled inland, absorbed into tribes, their names erased by the wilderness. Those are the explanations we tell ourselves, the ones that keep the story tidy, rational, safe. But the silence of Roanoke never fits neatly into those boxes. Every theory unravels against the evidence. No bones, no graves.
No proof of survival. Only absence is too perfect to accept. And then there are the voices.
The fragments of prayers, the desperate cries, the chilling warnings caught static centuries after they should have ceased to exist.
They do not sound like imagination.
They sound like intent, as though someone or something still lingers, reaching across time. Maybe the settlers never truly left. Maybe their final moments were captured in some impossible loop, endlessly replaying, calling out for help that will never come. Or maybe it is not them at all, but something old. Something that wears their voices like a mask, repeating the warning not to protect us, but to tempt us, because the most unsettling detail is not the mystery itself. It is an invitation. The static does not simply whisper, it beckons. Each recording feels less like a warning and more like bait, drawing us closer, daring us to respond. And if the signals are not for the colonists, then who are they meant for? Who is supposed to hear them? And most of all, what happens if one day someone